Hello, welcome to LetsLearnWise. In this video, we'll try to explore one of the important function in Numpy called as Linspace. So Linspace is used to generate a set of numbers within a range. So let's say if you wanted to generate any sine wave or any trigonometric wave, you need certain range from start to end, right? So that can be generated using Linspace. Or if you want any numbers to be generated with equally spaced in between, there you can use the Linspace. So without wasting the time, let's get into the implementation of it. So if you see here, we have a Jupyter notebooks already open. So in this, our first job is to import NumPy. Let's import it as NP. So first let's call a very simple function. So this is how we generally call the Linspace. In this, typically people will be entering the start position and the end position. So it will be start equal to, let's say you want us to start the range from 0 and stop till 10. Okay, so let's try to print it and we'll see how the output will be. So if you see here typically we have like huge number of values between the starting point of 0 to stopping point of 10. So let's assign a variable to it. So let's call it as a sample, and if I take the sample length, if I just count the sample length, you can see the number 50. So that means if we print the sample, by default the between start and stop, it is generating my 50 values. So what if you wanted to change? So there is an extra parameter called number. It's by default it is given as 50. So if you don't call that explicitly, it will be taking as a 50. But if you wanted to change that, and if you want a range between 0 to 10 with specific numbers, you can give. Let's say if you take 10 as a number, like it will be divided into 10 samples. Now if you see the shape of the sample is 10, and array, if you see the array, the output is 0 to 10, which is equally divided. Okay, so based on the number value, that will be equally divided. Now what if you wanted to get the interval of it? Okay, or you can, in other words, we can say as a resolution also. From 0 to 1 there is a small difference, and the same difference is getting added to each term to reach from 0 to 10. Now if you want to get that as well, you can simply use one parameter called read step, which will get me the step resolution also. By default it is false, so let me make it true. Okay, and if I just execute this sample, now if you see, along with this array we have an extra parameter called 1.11, which is the resolution. That means the gap between each of the sample within that range we can get. If in case you wanted for any other calculations, you can get, or else by default that value will be false. If you don't keep it as false, if by default it's false, so if you are planning to keep it as a false, you can just leave it by default. And now there is another exception in this. So let's say if you're starting with 0 and ending with 10. Now let's say if you don't want to include the stop value, that is the end value, then you can use we can call another parameter called endpoint. By default it's false, so if you make it true, by default it's true, you can make it false. Now if you see, it is not including the stop value. Okay, so the range will be from 0 to stop, excluding the stop, if you keep it as a false. Now if you wanted to include, you can simply keep it as a true. So this goes with 0 to the end, including the endpoint. Okay, in some cases we don't require that, we need to like remove that endpoint, we have to exclude that endpoint. So in that scenarios, we'll be like keeping it as a false. Now, and if you notice here if you see from 0 to 10, you can see the float value. So let's say if I increase the number, let's say if you want 15, samples, you can see the float values, right? Now what if you wanted the output in an integer? Then we have another parameter called d type, which stands for data type, and here you can give it as an int. So if you see, the float value is converted into int. Okay, now if I just by default it will be holding this particular value, call it as a none. So this is by default value. So all these four, coming to these four, are by default values. So in specific cases we might be using them, but in general we'll be going with start, stop, and number of samples that you want. And if in case you want the resolution of each step, then you can go with the red step as well. And d type and endpoint, it's optional again. And now there is one extra parameter, the last parameter, called axis. Axis by default value is 0. So if you don't observe any changes here. So in order to see what does this actual axis do, so let me take another sample. You can also create two-dimensional data as well in the Linspace. Okay, so np, let me call it again. So np.space, my start will be, let's say I wanted to start with an array of 1, 2. So it starts with array, okay, 1, 2, and it stops till let's say 9, 10. Okay, and I just want the number of samples will be 10. Okay, and I wanted to keep the red step to be false and endpoint to be false, and d type is also none. Now if you see, if I just print it out, sample 2d, let me print both the content as well as the shape of it, and print sample 2d dot shape. If we just look at this shape, now if you see, it's starting from 1, 2, which we specified, and ending at 0, 9, 10, which we specified to be stopped, and we said that we require 10 numbers. Okay, so it creates 10 and 10. Okay, so it starts from, it is almost similar to, so let's say 1 and 9 is the starting array. So if I just print it over here, np.linspace, if I just keep 1, 9, 10, if you see these values and these values, the first column of the 2d and this value is almost the same. And if you want the second column, so it will be 2, 10, 10. So that will be my second column. So it is taking, starting from 1 to 9, it will take 10 samples, and starting from 2 to 10, it will take 10 samples and make it into a matrix depending on the size that we have mentioned. So if you see here if number of samples is 2 and the shape is 10 by 2. Now if I keep axis equal to 0, axis is by default as a 0, so that will fetch me in this particular same sample, I'll get the same result. But if I change that axis to 1, the shape will be reversed. So it will be 2 cross 10. So it will be each sample will be stored in the form of a row. Okay, once that is created, then in the next one we will be creating the next row. So this became my second row data, and 1 to 9 will become my first data. Okay, so axis will be coming in picture whenever you are using more than one dimensional data. So as we are using this two-dimensional data, will be like, we can configure whether you want a row like 2 cross 10 or 10 cross 2. So it's up to us. Now if I just sum it up in np.linspace, we total have start, this is a mandatory that you have to keep, stop, this is also mandatory that you have to give, and number is optional, which will be by default stored as 50, and we have endpoint, which is by default true, which will include the endpoint, and next we have return step. Return step is by default false, so that means it doesn't return me anything. So if I keep it true, it will give me the resolution between each of the data point. And finally we have data type and data type and the axis. So data type by default will be having a none value. Okay, so it takes float value by default, and if axis will be by default 0, as we generally do most of the line space for one dimension, it just keep it as a 0. So in case if you're working on 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional data, you can change it to 1 or 0 based on what requirement you have for the input. That's it about the line space in NumPy package. I'll be covering more functions in NumPy in detail in the upcoming video. So please subscribe to our channel and like and share if you like the content. Thank you so much.